Snow fell in slow, tired flakes across the prairie, piling against fence posts and covering wagon tracks that led nowhere. Most folks in the small frontier town had already shuttered their doors for Christmas Eve, lanterns glowing behind frosted windows, families gathered close to warmth and prayer. The world felt quiet and safe for those lucky enough to belong somewhere. But at the edge of town, where the cold wind cut harder and the stars felt farther away, a lone stagecoach rolled to a stop beside the abandoned freight office. Its wheels creaked, horses snorted, and the driver barely waited before flicking the reins and pulling away. He didn't even turn back to look at the girl climbing down. She stepped into the snow, like someone expecting the ground to give beneath her. Her dress, once blue but now faded to a storm-washed gray, hung loose and torn at the hem. She wore no shawl, no gloves, just thin sleeves patched in places where someone tried to fix holes without thread that matched. The cold bit her skin instantly, coloring her cheeks the shade of raw winter roses. She clutched a single paper in her hand, a letter promising marriage, safety, and a new life. It was smudged, edges softened by days of travel and tears she tried not to admit were hers. Nobody came to greet her. She stood there, blinking through falling snow, whispering to herself that maybe she had arrived too late. Maybe the man who sent for her had forgotten. Or worse, maybe he never expected her to come at all. The world around her felt too big, too silent, too unwelcoming for someone who owned nothing but a paper and hope. She tightened her grip on her small satchel, holding it close like it contained her whole life. Even though it barely held more than a worn blanket and a broken hair comb, the church bell rang in the distance, calling families to gather for midnight prayers. She listened, wishing she had a place among them, wishing the letter in her hand could open doors. But the street remained empty. Snow collected in her hair, settled along her shoulders, and the wind pressed her back as if urging her to leave. She refused to move. She had come this far. She had survived this long. Turning back meant returning to a world that had already closed its doors on her across the frozen clearing. Quiet eyes watched her from the line of tall cottonwoods. A rider sat atop a dark horse, cloak wrapped tight against the cold, feathers tied to his hair lifting in the wind like silent signals. He had not come to town for celebration or prayer. He had come to observe, to see whether rumor held truth, that a mail-order bride was expected. A woman with no family, no protection, and no reason to trust the people who sent for her. The townsfolk spoke of such women like trade goods, purchased without ceremony, judged before they ever spoke. He had seen women come west before, only to vanish beneath broken promises. So he watched quietly, his breath steaming in the night air. He was known among his people for his strength, for guiding others, for protecting land and family. Most called him a father before they called him a warrior, because he held responsibility like a shield. He had seen hardship and hunger carve themselves across winter skies, and he understood what it meant to face the world alone. When he saw the girl step from the stagecoach, trembling in the snow yet refusing to fall, something in her posture spoke to him. She carried no pride, no arrogance, no demand for attention. She carried a quiet kind of strength. He saw it in the way she stood against the wind, refusing to let her thin dress or lack of welcome define her worth. She did not know he watched. She did not know anyone watched. She turned toward the nearest porch light, holding the letter forward like a shield, and stepped into town. But as she approached the saloon doorway, voices inside grew louder. Laughter carried through the walls, rough and careless. Someone mentioned the bride arriving, calling her nothing more than cheap help and a bargain wife. The girl stopped, her boots sinking deeper into the snow, breath shaking in the cold. She lowered the letter, not because she doubted her purpose, but because she suddenly understood how little she meant to the one who had summoned her. The wind shifted. The rider urged his horse closer, still silent, still unseen. He watched her shoulders stiffen, watched the world chip at her spirit before she even stepped inside. She did not cry. She simply turned away and walked toward the stable across the road, looking for shelter rather than welcome. A stray dog followed her, tail low, sensing kindness she didn't voice aloud. She knelt in the hay beside him, offering warmth from her own thin body. Whispering words meant for no one, the rider dismounted then, boots crunching softly in the snow. He approached without haste, letting the cold night carry his presence forward instead of his voice. He stopped several steps behind her, watching the way she wrapped her arms around herself, how she looked small, but not defeated. The dog rested at her side as though he belonged to her already, this close. He could see details he had not seen from the trees, the scar near her collarbone, the bruised knuckles from holding luggage too heavy for her frame, the determination in her jaw even when she thought no one could see. His people valued strength born from struggle, not strength born from comfort. And she carried that kind of strength. She sensed someone behind her and looked back slowly, eyes wide with fear she tried to hide. He met her gaze with the calm of someone who understood pain without asking for its story. The snow thickened between them, blurring town lights and softening the world. She rose to her feet, unsteady but proud, holding her letter like truth that only needed to be believed by someone willing to see it. He could have walked away. He could have left her to town gossip and cold promises. But something urged him forward, something beyond curiosity or duty. He did not know yet why destiny placed her before him on Christmas Eve, or why her presence stirred the quiet parts of his heart that had long been silent. He only knew she deserved more than the greeting she received. The girl parted her lips to ask who he was, but he lifted a hand gently, offering warmth rather than words. The wind quieted, as though waiting for what came next. And just as she took a hesitant step toward him, a voice from the saloon shouted her name, calling her like property someone finally chose to claim. She froze, eyes darting toward the noise. The rider's jaw tightened, and he turned toward the sound, already sensing trouble brewing on the other side of that door. Snow kept falling, but the night no longer felt quiet. He had seen her worth before anyone else. Now he needed to decide whether to step between her and the ones who believed they owned her fate. The door swung open behind them. Boots stomping into the street, and the man who sent for her finally appeared, but the rider moved first. The man who stepped out of the saloon carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. His coat was thick, lined with fur, boots polished even in the mud and snow. When he saw the girl, he lifted his chin as if confirming a purchase rather than seeing a human being who had traveled across harsh miles to reach him. He walked toward her with heavy steps, each one echoing through the empty street. Behind him, a few drunk men leaned on the doorway. Watching the scene like entertainment on a cold night, the rider shifted slightly to stand between the girl and the approaching man, though he did it so quietly that only the dog seemed to notice. The girl held her breath, unsure whether to move closer to safety or stay still out of respect for the promise she carried. She lowered her gaze, gripping the paper again, fingers trembling not just from cold but from the fear of disappointing the man who sent for her. She whispered a greeting, soft and tired. Nearly swallowed by the falling snow, the man looked at her from head to toe, eyes narrowing at the torn dress, patched sleeves, mud-stained boots. He frowned as if the sight offended him. He expected someone polished, someone fitting for his status, someone who looked new and untouched by miles of survival. He muttered that she looked different than he imagined, that he paid good coin for a bride who should arrive ready to be presented in town gatherings. The girl's heart sank, though she nodded without protest, as if she had grown used to carrying disappointment quietly. The rider didn't speak, but the tension in his shoulders changed. He had seen men judge women by cloth and surface, had seen promises twisted into ownership. His people believed a woman's worth was found in her spirit, not in fabric or coin. He stepped forward, just enough to show he was not a passing stranger. The saloon men noticed him now. Their laughter faded. Some recognized the markings on his cloak, the feathers woven into his hair. A few stepped back into the doorway, wanting no trouble with someone from the nearby tribe. The man who called for the girl cleared his throat, puffing his chest. He told her she would be taken to his ranch at daybreak after he finished his Christmas meal. He said there was no room tonight in town for someone looking like her, and she should wait in the stable until morning. He tossed her a small coin like he was paying for her patience, then turned away before she could respond. The coin landed in the snow between her boots, sinking just enough to disappear beneath ice. She stared at it, breath shaking, cheeks burning with shame. The dog nudged her leg, sensing her hurt. She didn't cry or protest. She simply bent down to pick up the coin, brushing off snow with numb fingers. She whispered that she would wait and not cause trouble. Her voice was steady, but not because she felt strong. It was steady because she had learned long ago that survival meant quiet obedience. The rider watched her bend, watched how carefully she held dignity even after being tossed aside like a forgotten promise. He stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. She looked at him with wide uncertainty, unsure why he stayed. He didn't speak yet, but his silence felt different from the man who walked away. This silence held understanding. He motioned toward the forest line where his horse waited, then toward the stable roof behind her. She understood he was asking if she had shelter. She nodded once, though her lips pressed tight as she fought the cold creeping into her bones. He stayed there another moment, then stepped back, giving her space. She watched him mount his horse with practiced ease. Snow collected on his cloak, settling into the folds. When he looked back at her from atop the horse, there was something unspoken in his eyes. Something she couldn't name but felt deeply. He rode off into the trees, vanishing as quietly as he had appeared inside the stable. Warmth came only from old hay and the slow breath of horses resting in their stalls. She found a corner near the back where a lantern hung, its flame weak but steady. She wrapped her warm blanket around herself and sat beside the dog, who curled against her ribs as though they belonged to one another. The rancher's men outside continued drinking and laughing, their voices fading into the night. She kept the letter on her lap, reading the same promises she had memorized long before boarding the train. A house, a husband, a life where she could belong. But she wondered now if she had misunderstood what belonging meant. She whispered prayers into the hay, asking for strength, asking for a sign that she had not traveled all this way to be unwanted again. The stable door creaked. She looked up with fear, expecting one of the drunk men. But instead, a young stable hand entered, arms full of blankets. He placed them near her without speaking too much, only saying that he didn't think she should freeze on Christmas Eve. His kindness was small, shy, uncertain, but it warmed her. He left before she could thank him properly. She wrapped the blankets around herself and the dog. Holding warmth like a borrowed miracle dot out in the forest, the rider reached his own camp hidden beyond the tree line. A fire burned low, guarded by others from this tribe who waited for him. They asked what he saw in town, asked why he stayed longer than planned. He answered quietly, saying only that the townsfolk had welcomed a woman with cold hearts. He did not explain the pull he felt, or why her presence unsettled him in a way that felt both familiar and new. The others warned him not to get involved with town affairs. They reminded him that winter was harsh, their own people needed protection, and helping outsiders often came with consequences. He nodded, listening with respect, but his thoughts drifted back to the girl alone in the stable, shivering with a paper that was supposed to give her a future dot. As dawn crept closer, the storm eased. The town slept, unaware that its newest arrival lay awake, wondering if she had already made a mistake. She finally drifted into a restless sleep, holding the dog close, holding hope even tighter. When morning came, she awoke to footsteps outside the stable. Men talking. Horses being prepared. The rancher had returned, ready to take her to his property as promised. But their voices didn't sound welcoming. They spoke of changing plans, of using her arrival to settle debts or gain favor among neighbors. She stiffened, realizing she might not be considered a bride at all, but leverage. Before she could stand, the stable door opened wide, snow blowing in. The rancher looked at her again, not with disappointment this time, but calculation. And somewhere beyond the tree line, the rider was already returning, drawn back by something he could not ignore. The day was only beginning, but trouble was already tightening around her. Waiting for the moment to strike, the rancher stood in the doorway of the stable with two men at his back, both wrapped in worn coats, hats pulled low. The girl rose slowly from her nest of blankets, the dog pressed close to her legs. Sunlight tried to push through the gray winter sky, painting the edges of the rancher's figure in pale light. He looked different in daylight, harsher somehow. Lines cut deep along his mouth, and his eyes carried a tired sharpness born from years of dust. "Debt and drink. You can stand, can't you?" he said, not really asking. "Daylight's wasting. We got a long ride to the ranch." She nodded and straightened, smoothing her dress without thinking. The thin fabric looked even worse in the cold morning light, the frayed cuffs, the mended seams. She clutched her letter against her chest as if it might still mean something. One of the men at the rancher's side smirked, shaking his head like he expected nothing better. "Thought you said she was young and strong," the man muttered. The rancher grunted. "Strong enough. She made it this far. That will have to do." They stepped aside to let her pass. The stable boy from the night before watched from the shadows between stalls, worry creasing his brow. When she walked by, he slipped a small piece of dried meat into her hand, pretending it was nothing. The dog wagged his tail, nose already searching her fingers. She gave the boy a soft thank you, barely above a whisper, and followed the men out into the snow. Outside, a wagon waited with its bed half full of supplies. A rough wool blanket stretched across the front seat. The rancher climbed up, motioning for her to sit beside him. The men hopped onto their horses, one on each side, like guards escorting a prisoner rather than companions escorting a bride. She glanced over her shoulder once, toward the tree line beyond the town. For a brief second, she thought she saw movement among the dark trunks, a shape that did not belong to the winter stillness. Her heart gave a small, strange leap. But then the rancher snapped the reins and the horses lurched forward, pulling her away from the town and toward a future that no longer felt like hers dotting the trees. The Apache father rode parallel to the road, keeping his distance. He had returned before dawn, drawn by a feeling he could not easily name. His people believed that certain moments were not accidents, that some paths were set in motion long before feet touched the trail. As he watched the wagon roll out of town, he remembered the girl's trembling hands, her quiet endurance, the coin in the snow. He also remembered another winter, years earlier, when he had asked for medicine from the town doctor for his wife and had been turned away. She had died in his arms while snow fell just like this. He had sworn then to keep, his heart guarded against the town and its promises. Yet now, watching the wagon carry the mail-order bride deeper into the frontier, that vow felt heavier than before. One of his kin rode up beside him, horse steaming in the cold air. "You followed again?" the man said quietly. "This is not our matter." She chose to come. "Choosing and knowing are not the same," the Apache father replied. She came with hope. "They treat her like trade." His companion shook his head. "If you interfere, the town will say you stole a white man's wife. You know how they speak about us already. Think of your child, your people." He thought of his young daughter back at camp, dark eyes bright, asking about snow and Christmas lights in town she had never seen. He thought of her future and how easily someone might one day look at her the way the rancher looked at the girl in rags. Then he looked back toward the wagon, rolling farther away. "We will watch for now," he said. "But if they break her spirit, that becomes our matter too?" The wagon left the last of the town behind. Houses gave way to open prairie and scattered cottonwoods, bare branches rattling softly in the wind. The girl sat stiff beside the rancher, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the letter hidden beneath the blanket. She tried to ask simple questions about the ranch, about the land, about the work expected of her, but his answers came short and clipped. "You cook, you clean, you help with the boys," he said. "There is plenty of work. My wife is gone, my sister-in-law does what she can. I need someone steady. I do not need trouble. You understand?" "Yes," she said. "I understand." He glanced at her again, eyes lingering on her worn dress. "You will need better clothes. Appearances matter when neighbors come. They already think I lost my sense when I sent for a mail-order bride right before Christmas." Her heart pinched at his words. Not because of the criticism, but because he spoke of her like a burden he had placed on himself, rather than a woman who risked everything to join him. She turned her eyes to the horizon where the land stretched wide and empty, snow shining in the pale light. The dog curled at her feet in the wagon bed, head resting on her boots. She focused on the gentle weight of him, reminding herself that not all living things here were unkind. As they reached a narrow creek crossing, the wagon wheel sank into soft earth hidden beneath the snow. The horses balked, snorting, hooves slipping on the icy bank. The rancher cursed under his breath, snapping the reins. The wagon leaned at a dangerous angle. One wrong move would send them sliding into the freezing water. "Hold the reins," he shouted. Thrusting the leather lines toward her, she took them without hesitation, bracing her boots against the footboard. While she steadied the team, he jumped down, boots splashing into slush. He pushed at the front wheel, muscles straining, jaw clenched. The horses tossed their heads, frightened. She spoke to them softly, voice low and gentle, words she had learned from watching teamsters on long roads. She did not yell or pull. She coaxed. She soothed. Bit by bit, the horses calmed enough to trust the pull of the reins. With a final heave, the wagon rolled up out of the rut and back onto solid ground. The rancher climbed aboard again, breathing hard. For a moment, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes as he looked at her. "You handled them well," he said. "Not many women I know can soothe a team that quick." She gave a small shrug. On the road, if a wagon broke down, no one had time to wait for men to fix everything. "We learned or we were left behind." He studied her in silence for another beat, then nodded once. "Maybe you will be of more use than I figured." The words were meant as praise or something close, but they still carried the weight of judgment. She swallowed and faced forward again, snowflakes catching on her lashes. From the rise above the creek, the Apache father watched the entire scene unfold. He noted the way she steadied the horses, the way the rancher's expression changed, if only a little. He saw resilience there, not weakness. It troubled him more than if she had broken down. Midday, they reached the ranch. It was not the grand homestead she had imagined from the letter's promises. A sagging porch wrapped around a house in need of fresh boards and paint. Smoke drifted from the chimney, carrying the smell of beans and coffee. A few sheds leaned near the corral, and a windmill creaked slowly, its blades turning against a cold sky. Two boys paused from their chores, leaning on pitchforks as they watched the wagon roll in. A woman stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a faded apron. Her eyes were sharp and tired, hair pinned back in a way that suggested she had long given up on vanity. She looked at the girl in the wagon, then at the rancher. "So she finally arrived," the woman said. "Smaller than you bragged about in town. Thought you were getting a strong one." The girl felt the words like stones thrown at her. The rancher climbed down and offered a hand to help her out, more for show than courtesy. She took it, boots landing on the frosty ground. The dog jumped after her, shaking snow from his coat. "This is my sister-in-law," the rancher said. "She keeps the boys in line. You will work with her in the house." The woman gave a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "We will see if you can keep up." Inside, the house was warmer than the stable had been, but the air carried a heaviness. The walls bore marks of old arguments, chairs scratched and repaired, blankets worn thin. The girl noticed a shelf with a few Christmas decorations, carefully arranged but somehow lonely. There were no soft touches, no lace, no bright colors, only what was necessary to survive. As she followed the woman to a small room off the kitchen, she heard the rancher speaking in low tones in the main room. He spoke about a visit he needed to make that evening, about a debt that had to be dealt with before the new year. He mentioned the banker in town, a man who never forgot a coin owed or a chance to gain more. "Maybe now that the bride is here, you have something to bargain with," one of the men said. Laughing under his breath, the words sliced deep. She paused in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. The sister-in-law glanced back, something like pity flickering across her face before she quickly hid it. "Do not listen to them," she said in a low voice. "Men talk big when they feel small inside. But you should know this. He is desperate. The ranch is not as strong as he pretends. If the banker takes this land, none of us will have a place to stand come spring." The girl's heart pounded. "And me?" she asked softly. "What happens to me if the land is taken?" The woman held her gaze for a long moment. "Bankers like pretty things they can control. Brides, land, whatever makes them look powerful. You came here on paper. Paper can be handed to someone else. Fear pressed against the girl's ribs. She tightened her grip on the letter hidden in her apron pocket. So, this was the main conflict she had walked into without knowing. She was not only a mail-order bride in the old American West. She was a piece in a struggle between a rancher and a banker, between debt and survival, between freedom and ownership. That night, as the sky darkened and the wind rose again, the rancher saddled his horse to ride back toward town. He left the girl in the care of his sister-in-law and the boys, saying he would return by morning if the trails stayed clear. The dog refused to leave the girl's side, curling at her feet as she sat by the small window, watching his figure shrink against the snow far beyond the barn on a low ridge. The Apache father and two of his kin watched the ranch come alive with lantern light. Smoke rose straight into the sky, carrying the scent of stew and wood smoke. To most eyes, the ranch looked like any other frontier home, rugged and struggling. To his eyes, it looked like a place where a fragile soul might be ground down by worry and want. "We should turn back," one of his kin said. "You have seen enough. This is their own trouble." He did not answer at once. He watched the small figure at the window, barely more than a shadow, yet somehow clear to him. She moved with a careful weariness, like someone bracing for a blow that had not yet fallen. "In the stories told by our elders," he said finally, "the Creator does not stay silent when someone is treated like a broken tool. Maybe we were brought near for a reason." Inside the house, the boys whispered about the new woman, wondering if she would be strict or kind. The sister-in-law sat at the table, mending a shirt by lantern light, her jaw set. She had seen enough winters to know when trouble was moving in. She listened to the wind, to the distant creak of the windmill, to the restless bark of the ranch dog outside. The girl lay awake on the narrow bed in the small room, staring at the ceiling. The letter rested on her chest. The lines that once promised safety now felt like threads tying her to something she did not understand. Her mind replayed the way the rancher's friends spoke, the way they joked about her as if she were a tool for bargaining. A sudden sound broke through the night. Faint but sharp hoofbeats, not just one horse but several, heading toward the ranch. The dog by her door lifted his head, ears pricked. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and leather. The girl sat up, heart racing. Out on the ridge, the Apache father heard the same thing and turned his head toward the approaching sound. Whoever rode toward that ranch at this hour was not coming for Christmas blessings, and none of them knew yet whether those riders were bringing a chance at salvation or the start of something far worse. Night settled heavy over the ranch. The sky a deep slate with thin clouds drifting across the moon. The windmill creaked in slow circles, a lonely sound that echoed across the open land. The girl sat upright on the narrow bed, hands pressed flat against the blanket, listening to the hoofbeats drawing closer. They were too steady to belong to the rancher returning home tired from town. These riders moved with purpose. Their pace was quick, and the rhythm of the hooves carried a sense of urgency. Not travel. The dog moved first, padding toward the door, ears forward, tail stiff. She followed him carefully, peeking through the small window. The lantern outside cast long shadows across the yard, stretching over snow and packed dirt. In the faint glow, shapes appeared, horses emerging from the darkness. 3 riders, all bundled in heavy coats, none speaking. Their horses exhaled white steam into the cold air, hooves crunching the frozen ground as they slowed near the fence. The sister-in-law stepped onto the porch with a rifle resting in her arms. Not pointed, but held with the confidence of someone accustomed to danger. The boys stood behind her, faces pale and frightened, though they tried to look brave. The riders stopped just beyond the gate. Snow settled on their coats and hats, turning them into dark silhouettes against the pale ground. One rider called out, voice low and controlled. He said he came with a message for the rancher, news that could not wait until dawn. The sister-in-law asked why they rode at night and not during daylight like decent men. The rider answered that trouble didn't respect daylight. His voice held a tone that made it impossible to tell whether his intentions were harmless or ominous. The girl watched through the window, hugging her arms across her chest. She knew nothing of these men, but instinct told her they were not simply neighbors checking on winter feed or asking for help with a broken wagon. The ranch carried tension like a taut rope, and these men had pulled one end of it. The sister-in-law finally lowered the rifle but did not invite them inside. She told them the rancher was in town settling business and would return when he pleased. The riders exchanged glances, then the tallest leaned forward in his saddle and spoke again, saying business with a ranch in debt never waited patiently. He nodded toward the house as though he already knew who slept inside. The dog growled softly from the girl's feet. The men rode off soon after, disappearing back into the dark just as silently as they had arrived. But their presence left a mark, an invisible weight pressing on the ranch walls. When the door closed, the sister-in-law stood still for a moment, listening to the wind. She told the boys to go to bed and told the girl to lock her door. Not because she needed protection from anyone in the house, but because there were times when fear traveled farther than footsteps. The girl lay back down only when the house grew quiet, though sleep never came. She stared at the wooden beams above her, listening to the storm picking up again. Snow tapped the window gently, as if asking to be let in. The dog curled beside her bed, silent but watchful. Out beyond the ridge, the Apache father watched the riders leave. He saw the direction they headed and recognized the trail leading back toward a cluster of homesteads known for trouble. He narrowed his eyes, remembering men from that area who traded more in intimidation than cattle. He wondered what business they had with a ranch on the edge of winter, especially one already held tight by debt. "Do you see now?" one of his kin whispered. "This is not our burden." He did not answer, because something deeper stirred beneath the surface. It wasn't just the girl anymore. It was the way everything around her seemed to be shifting, as if she had stepped into a storm already brewing long before she arrived. By morning, the sky cleared. Frost iced the fence rails and crisp sunlight fell across the fields. The girl worked in silence beside the sister-in-law, carrying water from the well, mending torn blankets, peeling potatoes for stew. The boys whispered about the riders, about whether they would return, about whether the rancher would come back at all. Each passing hour carried more unease. When the rancher finally returned, snow dusting his shoulders, he looked worn from more than travel. He hung his coat on the rail and brushed past his sister-in-law, avoiding her questions. The girl watched him from the kitchen doorway. His eyes were red and tired, his jaw stiff. He didn't greet her. He didn't greet anyone. He simply sat at the table, hands pressed to his forehead. The sister-in-law poured him coffee without asking. "Did you pay him off?" He didn't look up. "Not fully. So what happens now?" "Now I finish what I started." He rose again, pacing the room like a man caught between two decisions, neither one clean. The girl stepped closer, voice gentle, asking if he needed help. He looked at her with something almost like regret, though pride masked the emotion before it reached his mouth. "You came because of that letter," he said. "But letters don't show the whole truth. I thought I could fix everything before you arrived. I was wrong." She swallowed hard. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you're here at a time when this land is slipping through my hands. And the banker knows it. Last night I offered him stock, equipment, anything to buy time. He said if I couldn't pay, he would take the property and everything on it." "Everything," she repeated. He nodded slowly. "Including you if you stay tied to me by paper." The room grew still. The sister-in-law stopped moving, hands frozen above the wash basin. The dog sat straighter, ears twitching. The rancher looked away, ashamed. He said he never meant to bring her into danger, that he sent for a bride hoping to salvage a broken home, not trap another soul in his failures. He rubbed his temples, saying the riders from the night before were likely sent to remind him how little time remained before she could speak. The door opened with a cold gust, and the Apache father stepped inside. He did not enter as an intruder, nor as someone asking permission. He entered with quiet certainty, as though he walked into a truth already waiting for him. Snow melted on his cloak, dripping onto the floor. His expression held no threat, only purpose. The rancher stood quickly tense. The sister-in-law reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, though she didn't lift it. The girl stepped forward instinctively, unsure why her heart steadied in his presence. He spoke to the rancher first, saying he saw the riders last night and wanted to know why men of that kind circled a ranch on Christmas week. The rancher hesitated, then admitted the truth. He owed more than he could pay and had run out of time. The Apache father listened, his gaze steady, but his eyes flicked briefly to the girl, as if measuring how deep she had already sunk into this struggle. The rancher then asked why he cared. Why a man from beyond the tree line watched over a household that was not his. The Apache father replied that he did not care about the ranch or the debt. He cared about how easily people without power were traded in the name of bargains. The words struck the girl like wind against flame, fanning something inside her she had not dared to feel yet. Before anyone could speak again, hoofbeats thundered across the yard, louder than before, faster, closer. The dog barked fiercely, hackles raised. The boys scrambled to the window. Outside, riders gathered once more, not 3 this time, but more. Their coats billowed in the wind, horses stamping the frozen ground with impatience. The sister-in-law whispered that these men did not come to talk. The rancher's face hardened. He reached for his coat and gun, eyes narrowing with a mix of fear and determination. The girl grabbed his arm, not pleading but searching his face for truth. He told her this was his fight, that she should stay inside. The Apache father stepped to the doorway, placing himself between the family and the incoming danger, cloak lifting in the rising wind. His horse waited tethered near the fence, ready to move at the slightest command. The riders halted just beyond the porch. The leader slid off his horse, boots crunching hard in the snow. He shouted the rancher's name and demanded payment before Christmas night ended. He said if coin could not be found, something else of equal value must be offered. His eyes drifted to the girl. The dog growled louder. The sister-in-law stepped forward. The boys held their breath, and just as the rancher moved to face the man, the Apache father stepped off the porch, snow bursting beneath his boots. Standing between the girl and the threat now unfolding, the leader smirked, adjusting his gloves, unaware that the next moments would decide far more than land or debt. The wind rose. Clouds slid across the moon and the night held its breath, waiting for the first spark to fly. Snow swirled across the yard as the riders waited, their horses restless, their breath filling the air like smoke. The leader stood with his boots planted wide, hands resting on his belt as if he already owned the land beneath his feet. The rancher stepped forward slowly, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. The girl stood back near the doorway, the dog pressed to her leg, while the Apache father remained between her and the threat. His presence steady and unshaken, the leader demanded an answer, saying the rancher had until nightfall to offer payment or surrender something worth more than money. The rancher replied that he would not hand over his home or anyone living under its roof. He said he would work the land, sell stock, take on more jobs, gather every coin he could. But the leader shook his head, saying the time for promises had passed. He pointed toward the girl in rags, calling her a pretty piece of fortune wasted on a failing ranch. He suggested she be traded to settle the debt, that she could serve in town where men with gold had a use for her. The rancher stepped forward quickly, voice rising, saying she was not for sale. The leader mocked him, calling him a man desperate enough to buy a bride but too weak to keep what he paid for. He took one step closer, but before he could say more, the Apache father moved. He stepped into the open, hands lifted to show he carried no weapon drawn. His voice was calm yet firm, carrying across the wind. He said no woman who arrived with nothing but hope should be treated like property. He said the frontier already took too much from those who had little, and taking more brought curses upon men who forgot their humanity. The riders shifted uneasily, not because of the words themselves, but because of the steadiness behind them. The leader laughed, but it was a laugh that hid discomfort. He warned the Apache father to stay out of business that was not his. The Apache father replied that dignity and justice were everyone's business. The rancher stepped beside him, standing shoulder to shoulder for the first time, no longer hiding his fear but facing it. The standoff grew quiet. Snow fell heavier. The girl watched from the doorway, hand pressed to her chest, heart pounding. She felt the weight of every mile she traveled, every cold night she survived, every whispered prayer she carried. She stepped forward, not to fight, but to speak. She told the leader she came to this land to build a life, not to be used to pay a man's pride. She said she would work the ranch, help raise the boys, help rebuild what was broken. She said she would not belong to anyone who saw her worth only in trade. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as she continued, telling them she crossed states and storms with nothing but faith. She was not afraid of work, cold, or hardship, but she would not return to a life where her value was measured by a coin purse. The leader stared at her silently, sizing her up in a different way now. The wind gusted, lifting her hair and filling the yard with quiet urgency. Before the leader could respond, one of his own men leaned close and whispered something to him. The leader's expression changed, frustration replacing arrogance. He finally backed away, saying the rancher had one chance to settle the debt by spring. If the ranch still stood by then, they would leave it alone. If not, they would return. He mounted his horse, muttering that some fights weren't worth freezing over. With a sharp whistle, he led his men away, disappearing into the tree line. For a long while, no one spoke. The rancher lowered his shoulders, exhausted. He looked at the Apache father and said he could not repay the help given tonight, but he did not forget it. The Apache father nodded once, then turned to leave. The girl watched him, uncertain whether to call out or let him fade into the cold as quietly as he came. She took a small step forward and thanked him. She thanked him for seeing her before anyone else did, for stepping between danger and her without expecting anything in return. He paused, studying her with eyes that held years of loss and healing. He told her strength was not loud or forceful. It was quiet, steady, and carried in the way she held herself against the world. He told her she was not alone anymore. He rode off into the twilight, snow swirling behind his horse, returning to his camp and waiting family. But he looked back once, just long enough for her to know he had not disappeared entirely from her story. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. The rancher worked long hours, taking every honest job he could find. The sister-in-law softened slightly, giving the girl space to learn rather than expecting perfection. The boys grew attached to her, following her around the yard, listening to stories she told while peeling potatoes or tending to the fire. The dog never left her side, becoming her shadow in every room. The girl slowly transformed the house with small touches of warmth, fresh mended curtains, herbs drying above the stove, a repaired quilt on the boys' beds, candles carved from leftover wax. Nothing extravagant, just signs of someone who cared enough to build something new. The rancher apologized more often now, speaking without pride or assumption. He stopped calling her a bride by paper and began calling her a partner in rebuilding the homestead. He worked beside her, listening when she spoke, respecting her choices. He even returned to town one evening to return the remaining letter to the banker, telling him she belonged to no contract. If she stayed, it would be by her own choosing. When spring thaw arrived, the land began to shift. Snow melted into rich soil, and birds returned to the cottonwoods. The ranch had survived the winter. The men from the night never returned. One afternoon, while hanging sheets to dry on the line, the girl heard hoofbeats approaching from the ridge. She turned, heart quickening. The Apache father rode into view, his daughter riding beside him, her small hands gripping the reins proudly. They came not for trouble nor obligation, but to visit. The girl smiled, stepping forward to greet them, realizing that somewhere between snowstorms and fear, she had found a home that connected more than land and fences. She no longer stood in rags. She stood with purpose. The ranch that once felt broken now carried life again. The land, the people, and the future finally aligned. Not because someone saved her, and not because she saved them, but because each chose to stand together rather than apart. She came as a mail-order bride with nothing to offer except hope. In return, she gained a family, a place to belong, and a life of her own choosing. And when the wind swept across the plains at dusk, carrying the scent of cedar smoke and warm earth, she finally felt something she had never known on any road before. She felt at home.